Hello, colleagues. I wanted to take some time and give you all some general feedback from the assignment this week. I, Instead of doing it one by one, there were some kind of common themes that I thought might be more valuable for everyone and more meaningful if I just shared for the entire group all at once. So that's what we're doing here in this quick video. There's a couple things I want to accomplish in this video, and one is I want to talk a little bit about identifying qualitative methods and what my feedback meant when I said something like what kind of data was in this or what analyses were done. So I kind of want to. I feel like maybe when I just made those comments that it doesn't, just says it just there's not much explanation with that comment. So I wanted to give everyone a kind of chance to hear what I was thinking about. And for those of you who did a good job, maybe you can see why you did a good job. Second, I'll go over the kind of orient you a little bit to the rubrics and a way to engage with those rubrics. I think that might be helpful. And then third are some tips for annotations that you might want to consider. So in the case of qualitative methods and analyzing qualitative methods, I think it's really important to understand a fundamental point here, that qualitative is not a method. It is a category of methods. In the same way that quantitative is not a method, right? Quantitative is not a method. Independent t-test is. A regression or multiple regression or an ANOVA or a correlation study, those are different methodologies. They all fit in the category of quantitative, but quantitative is in and of itself not a method. And the same thing is true of qualitative, that there is no such thing as a qualitative method. There is a category, and then there are methods that fit within this category of qualitative. So it might be something like a case study or an autoethnography or some kind of evaluation or action research. So when you're looking at and you're evaluating a source that is a qualitative study, you might really benefit from saying, what kind of qualitative study is this? And identify, if the authors are not able to identify that for you, it's probably not a good source. It's probably not written as fully as you might wish. So understanding that qualitative is not a method, but it is a category or a grouping of methods can be very, very valuable in then identifying what the method actually is. Second, identify what the types of data are. Several of you got this comment from me, and you would be forgiven for thinking, well, qualitative methods, the data is text or the data is interviews, but it's a lot more than that. There are a lot more options than just interviews or just text. Sometimes it will be field notes or close observation or distance observation. It might be some kind of documentation or document analysis. Sometimes it's images. Sometimes it's interview text that's like an interview protocol, and sometimes that interview protocol is semi-structured and sometimes it's unstructured. So how did several of you found examples of surveys that were assessed qualitatively rather than quantitatively? That would be a kind of data. So identify what the data source is and kind of understand and explicate for yourself what that data source is. It can be very valuable when you're going back and looking back at an article or looking back at your annotation and understanding, oh yeah, these are the people that did something with photographs and they used photographs from this period and that kind of. So identify what the data is. And then identify the kinds of analyses that are done. It's again, a person could be forgiven for thinking, oh, it's coding. Yeah, it's oftentimes coding, but there are different kinds of coding. There are kinds of like the in vivo coding where we allow the subjects to identify what the codes are and we use their language. And so, or we might have emerging themes that as the researcher becomes more and more familiar with the data set and has more time with the data. There are themes that emerge. I might use axial coding. I might use a priori coding where I've come up with a set of codes that I'm going to impose on the data. So there are a number of different approaches to coding that could be done. So, coding is, again, it's like qualitative. It is a category of analyses, but which category of analyses did the authors use? So those are some things to think about when you're evaluating qualitative methods and when you're reading others' research. And some of this stuff is stuff we haven't even gone over yet, right? But just watch for it and see what you can see. In the next part, I want to talk a little bit about orienting to the rubric. Be sure that when you are doing your assignments that you're looking at what those rubrics are. So there is the assignment that you want to read very carefully. Several of you, it seems, were surprised by part 2. And part 2 had a lot of points in it. So keep in mind, read the assignment carefully, but also take a look at those rubrics. Especially in this course, the rubrics are really well developed. They're just great. But if you don't read the rubrics, you might not recognize how you're being graded on those assignments. And a good rule of thumb is shoot for exceptional, right? That's what you're shooting for as a doc student. But it also may be valuable to look at some of those other categories that you don't want to score in, but see what they're noting, right? Because it becomes distinguishing from what is exceptional. So I'm thinking about in this last one, on that last rubric category, or second to the last rubric category, of bringing in other research. One of the categories said didn't use any outside sources. Well, you can kind of see the point is if you bring in outside sources, that's where you earn extra points on that rubric. So look carefully at those rubrics. And then lastly, I wanted to talk a little bit about your annotations, some things to think about when you're doing your annotations. One big one, very, very big issue is if you are going to quote the source, if you're going to use their language, if you're going to use more than 7 consecutive words from your source, especially in your annotated bibliography, put quotation marks around that. Let me tell you why. As a reader, I recognize when I'm reading your annotation that there's a good chance that there is the author's language in this. So it's ideal when you can paraphrase things into your own language. That can be very helpful, especially on an annotation. But sometimes you can't. Sometimes if you're going to the research question, if you're going to bring it in, it might be word for word. So if you are going to quote word for word, make sure you put quotation marks around it and cite it like you would cite normally in text. And the reason for this is that you are going to be using annotations for your dissertation, for example. Oh, you should be. And when you do, and you bring over text from your annotated bibliography into your dissertation, for example, well, if you don't have quotation marks around on your annotations, you have no idea whether this is your words or the author's words. And if you haven't been great about identifying that and consistent, then you could accidentally plagiarize in a document that you publish, or in your dissertation, or in a course, in a project for a course. You could assume that this was in your language and it's not. So put stuff into your language as often as you can, but also be very, very careful that when you can't and you have to use the author's language, that you put quotation marks around anything that is 7 consecutive words or longer. Second, there were several instances where I saw some rather broad statements. You might make a broad statement that that these are, let's say, for example, politically, these are tenuous times and people are in great disagreement with one another about politics. It's true, right? It's absolutely true. And you may find an author like Finkelstein et al. Who will say that very statement. But it's pretty broad, isn't it? And so it's not really telling us new information. So when you're thinking about your annotation, really avoid those broad general ideas that are consistently brought up in the literature, and really get into the meat of that particular source. What is their research question? How did they answer their research or how did they investigate their research question? What was their methodology? What were their data? What were their analyses? What were their findings? What were the implications? What were the limitations? How is this useful to you? Really think in those terms. And when I say use wooden statements, what I'm actually saying here is this might not be great poetry. What you're actually doing here is saying, listen, I've got an annotation. I'm not worried about flow. I'm not worried about this being good literature. I'm worried about getting information out of the source and into my annotation so that I can extract it from my annotation when I need to. So be comfortable with a very wooden format. I've included a link in the notes section here that to a video on how to think about annotated bibliography. If you want to look at that, it might be useful and helpful. You might have wished you had that before, but it is what it is. Hey, if you need any further explanation, do not hesitate to schedule some time with me. Let's talk about it. If your grade was just way below what you normally score and you really want to recalibrate with me, we could talk about what that would look like and give you a chance to potentially to resubmit if you need to. But it's just a portion, and there's a really good chance that you can make up a lot of those points just on other assignments. So we could talk about that. Just schedule some time and we'll get together and we'll talk. Let me know how I can help you. Bye-bye.